In this section, we're going to very quickly put the configuration together for our multi-worker deployment. After that, we're going to make sure that we take all of our different config files that we've put together and throw them all back into kubectl through that apply command and just get kind of a general idea of where all of our work is at. So let's put the configuration together for the multi-worker pod. As you might guess, this file is going to look very similar to the config that we put together for the other two deployments. So inside my K8s directory, I'm going to make a new file called workerdeployment.yaml. Then inside of here, we'll put together config very similar to the other deployments. We'll say API version is going to be apps v1. The kind of object that we are creating is a deployment. We'll give a metadata section to this thing with a name of worker-deployment. And then we'll provide a spec to this thing as well. So for replicas, we're going to start off with just a single replica or a single pod running the multi-worker image. Remember that if there's anything inside of our application that really needs to scale out and have multiple instances, it probably is the multi-worker, because that was the image or the container inside of our application that was doing that Fibonacci calculation, and that was the absolutely slowest part of our entire application. And so at one point in time, or at some point in time, we might want to come back and put a little bit more work into that thing to make sure that it is scaled properly. But for right now, we're going to start off with just a single replica so that we can eventually see that, yeah, this thing needs to be scaled, and we can figure out how to do that at that point in time. All right, so after that, we'll provide our selector. We'll say that we want to attempt to match a label on some other object inside of our cluster. And for this one, we'll give a component of worker, because that's really its job. It is a worker container inside of our application. After that, we'll put together our template for the pods that are created. Remember that the template property goes on the same indentation layer as selector. We'll provide a metadata to the template where we'll provide the different labels that need to be applied to every pod that gets created. And of course, we're going to provide a label that matches the selector that we had specified just a second ago. So under labels, I'll say component worker. After that, I'll unindent back out to the metadata section, or metadata kind of indentation layer, I suppose, and we'll provide a spec that's going to configure exactly what this pod is running. So we're going to say that we want to run a single container, but remember, it is plural, containers like so. And then the single container that we want to run is going to have a name of worker. It's going to use the image of your Docker ID, multi-worker. And then just as before, we are going to eventually need to stuff in some environment variables into this thing to tell it how to connect to Redis. But for right now, we're just going to kind of ignore that for a second. We're going to first set up Redis and make sure that's working correctly. And then we're going to come back to both our worker and Express API deployments and add in the environment variables at that point in time. Now, the other thing I want to mention here is if you look at this diagram, remember there is nothing inside of our worker image or the worker container that's running here that needs to be accessible from anything else inside of our cluster. In other words, there's no other object whatsoever, no other service, no other image, no container, no nothing that needs to directly connect to the multi-worker and try to get some information out of it. The multi-worker is going to connect to something else inside of our application, but nothing is going to make an unprompted request into the multi-worker. And as such, the multi-worker does not need to have any port assigned to it, and it does not need to have any service assigned to it either. We only make use of services when we want to have requests going into a set of pods, or into a single pod for that matter. And because that's not the case here, no need for a service, no need to worry about any ports. Okay, so with that in mind, that's pretty much it for this file. No ports required. So we're just going to finish it off like so, and we do not need to create an associated service file. So let's save this as is. We'll take a quick pause right here, and when we come back in the next section, we're going to take the 3 config files that we just put together in the last couple of videos and throw them into kubectl through the apply command. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.